The German women knew what Americans did to prisoners. At least, that's what they'd been told for years. Standing in the suffocating Louisiana heat of July 1945, watching American soldiers approach with clipboards and stern faces, they braced for the nightmare to begin. And when the translator spoke those 5 words, words that seemed to confirm every horrifying prophecy, their world stopped spinning. But what happened next would shatter everything they believed about enemies, about war, and about which side deserved to win. If you want to hear more untold stories from World War II, smash that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover will change how you see history forever. The train doors opened, and hell poured in. Not the hell of fire and bombs they'd escaped in Germany, but a different kind. Thick, wet, crushing heat that made breathing feel like drowning. This was Louisiana in summer, and the 23 German women stepping onto American soil had never experienced anything like it. Within seconds, their filthy uniforms were soaked through with sweat. They looked at each other with wild, terrified eyes. Margaret, just 22, clutched a small bag containing everything she owned: a photo of her mother, socks with holes, and a broken comb. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Elsa, the 34-year-old nurse who'd seen soldiers die screaming on the Eastern Front, stood straighter than the rest, but even she felt fear crawling up her spine like icy fingers. The youngest was Greta, only 17, who'd lied about her age to serve. The oldest was Frau Weber, 46, with gray streaking through blonde hair that hadn't been properly washed in months. They had nothing in common except their terror and their uniforms, now little more than rags after 3 weeks of hell getting here. But they had no idea the real horror hadn't even started yet. The journey from Germany had been a nightmare of its own. Rounded up by British forces near Bremen, handed to American MPs like cattle changing owners. 12 days in a Liberty ship's cargo hold, sharing space with military equipment, vomiting more than eating. Most were seasick the entire voyage, consuming nothing but crackers and water, watching their own bodies waste away. When they reached New Orleans, they could barely walk. A few hours in processing, tin cups of water, then loaded onto a train. Through the windows, they watched America roll past, and it looked nothing like the war-torn landscape they'd left behind. No rubble, no burned-out buildings, no corpses in the streets, just normalcy, prosperity, life. It made no sense. They were supposed to be the superior civilization, the master race, the 1,000-year Reich. But Germany was ashes, and America looked untouched. What else had they been lied to about? Camp Ruston spread before them like an alien world. Rows of wooden barracks in perfect military lines. Guard towers at each corner, but strangely, not threatening. No machine gun nests, no searchlights, just bored-looking American soldiers sweating in the afternoon heat. Then the smell hit them. Food. Real food. Meat frying. Bread baking. Coffee brewing. For women who hadn't eaten a proper meal in months, the aroma was physically painful, their stomachs cramped with desperate hunger and anticipation. But there were other smells too. Disinfectant, bleach, industrial soap. The propaganda screamed in their heads. The Americans will strip you naked. They will humiliate you. They will treat you worse than animals. The clean chemical smell seemed to confirm every warning. Margaret grabbed the arm of the woman next to her. "This is it," she whispered in German. "This is where it starts." The sounds were wrong too. English commands, sharp and incomprehensible. The women had learned a few English words in school, but the rapid-fire Louisiana drawls of the guards might as well have been alien language. They caught fragments: line up, move, stop, but most was just threatening noise. And then, impossibly, music. American jazz floating across the compound from somewhere. Music that had been banned in Germany as degenerate. Music that meant they were truly in enemy territory now. An American officer approached. Tall, over 6 feet, wearing a uniform so clean it seemed to glow after years of seeing only gray Wehrmacht colors and mud. He carried a clipboard and looked at them with an expression they couldn't read. He spoke in English. None understood. He sighed. Tried again slower, using hand gestures. They were to form a line. Follow the guards. Be processed. That word. processed, sent ice through their veins. They were herded toward a long, low building at the camp's edge. With every step, the fear became something physical. It sat in their chests like stones. It made their legs weak and their hands clammy. Because they all knew what processing meant. This was where they would lose everything. This was where the Americans would do what victors always did to the defeated. The building was called the Delousing and Medical Processing Center. But they didn't know that. They only saw a structure with windows covered in wire mesh and a door that looked far too small. They were marched inside in groups of 5. Margaret was in the first group. She walked through the door, holding hands with 4 other women like children afraid of the dark, and the room inside was bright, too bright. Electric lights hummed overhead. They'd gotten used to candles and oil lamps in Germany's final months. This harsh light felt like an interrogation. A young American soldier waited. Red hair, freckles, maybe 25. He looked nervous, which somehow made everything worse. He held a paper like he was reading instructions he didn't want to follow. Then the translator spoke. Mrs. Fisher was a German-American woman from New Orleans who'd volunteered to help with POW processing. She looked at the German women with something between sympathy and sternness. The soldier spoke in English. Mrs. Fisher translated into German. You will be medically examined for diseases and parasites. You will shower and be deloused. You will be given clean clothing. The words landed like blows. This was it. This was the humiliation they'd been promised. Anna, a supply clerk, began crying silently, tears streaming without sound. The soldier continued. Mrs. Fisher translated. You will remove all your clothing and place it in these bags. It will be burned. Lice. Do you understand? Lice and disease. We cannot have an outbreak. The women couldn't move, couldn't breathe, stripped naked in front of male soldiers. This was the nightmare scenario. This was the violation they'd feared above all else. The soldier looked uncomfortable. He spoke again. There are no female nurses available today. The medical examination will be conducted by male doctors, but it will be professional and brief. The showers are private. You will go in groups of 5. No men will be present during showers. Some small mercy, at least. But then he said something else, something that would echo in their memories forever. The soldier looked at Mrs. Fisher, spoke in English, and she translated. Tonight, you will sleep without your clothes. Time stopped. Sleep without your clothes. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret felt her vision swim. The room tilted. This was worse than death. This was the complete destruction of humanity. They would be kept naked like animals, displayed, humiliated, broken. This is it, she thought. The mask is dropping. The cruelty is beginning. But before total panic could take over, Mrs. Fisher added something the soldier hadn't said. She looked at the women with what might have been kindness. He means your old clothes, she said in German. Your uniforms are infested with lice. They must be burned. You will be given nightgowns tonight, but they are still being prepared. For one night, you will sleep in clean underwear and undershirts we provide. Tomorrow morning, you will receive full uniforms. Prisoner uniforms, but clean and whole. The women stood frozen. Not naked. Not completely naked. Just without their outer clothes. Just for one night. Because of lice. Because of disease. Not as punishment, as hygiene. But the fear didn't leave immediately. Years of propaganda don't evaporate in seconds. They still believed this was a trick. That the kindness was a mask that would drop to reveal cruelty underneath. And what happened next would test that belief in ways they never imagined. They were led behind a canvas partition one by one. An American military doctor waited. Older, maybe 50, gray hair, reading glasses. He barely looked at them. He checked their throats. Looked in their eyes. Listened to their hearts with a stethoscope. 2 minutes per woman. That was it. The doctor was professional. Almost bored. He didn't leer. He didn't touch them inappropriately. He simply checked they weren't carrying diseases that could spread through the camp. When Margaret's turn came, she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. The doctor looked at her with what seemed like concern. He spoke to Mrs. Fisher. The doctor says you are malnourished but healthy. He is giving you a vitamin pill. Take it with water. He handed her a small white pill and pointed to a cup of water. Margaret took it with trembling fingers. The water tasted clean and cold, nothing like the rusty, questionable water she'd been drinking for months. The doctor made a note and gestured for her to move on. That was it. No torture, no violation, just a routine medical check. But the worst was yet to come. The delousing station, 5 shower stalls behind a curtain, female guards, WWII, Women's Army Corps members, stood waiting. American women in uniform who looked at the German prisoners with curiosity and distaste. They communicated through gestures. Each German woman received a towel, a bar of white soap, and a small bottle of something that smelled sharply medicinal. Delousing shampoo. It would kill the lice infesting their hair and bodies. One of the WWII made an impatient gesture. Take off your clothes. Put them in the bags. Now. Slowly, reluctantly, the women began to undress. They turned their backs to each other, trying to preserve some scrap of dignity. Buttons came undone with shaking fingers. Skirts dropped, undergarments peeled away. Soon they stood naked, clutching towels, more vulnerable than they'd ever been. Their uniforms were scooped up by a guard using a long pole, as if the clothes themselves were contaminated. The garments disappeared into canvas bags marked with red crosses. Margaret watched her uniform vanish and felt a strange loss. That uniform had been her identity for 2 years. Now it was gone, condemned as too diseased to save. They stepped into the shower stalls. The water came on with a rush, and it was hot. Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot. Steaming hot water that seemed impossible after years of cold water baths or no baths at all. Margaret stood under the stream and something inside her broke. She began to cry. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. The hot water washed over her, washing away months of dirt, sweat, fear, and exhaustion. She scrubbed with the soap until her skin turned red. She used the delousing shampoo, which stung her scalp but felt cleansing. She stood under the water until it ran clear, then stood longer, not wanting to leave this small moment of comfort. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Some cried, some laughed, strange, almost hysterical laughter. Frau Weber stood with hands pressed against the tile wall, head bowed under the water, shoulders shaking. When they finally emerged, wrapped in towels, clean clothes waited. Not nightgowns as promised, but something even stranger. Men's undershirts, large and white, and men's boxer shorts. The WWII pointed to these items, their sleeping clothes for tonight. Tomorrow would bring proper prisoner uniforms. The women dressed in these oversized garments that hung on their thin frames like tents. They looked at each other and might have laughed under different circumstances. They looked ridiculous. But they were clean. For the first time in months, they were truly clean. And then they smelled the food. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. It smelled like heaven. American soldiers were eating at some tables, but the German women were directed to a separate section. They sat gingerly, unused to the kindness of actual chairs after weeks of sitting on floors or hard benches. Then a guard brought a tray to their table. What was on it seemed like a hallucination. Mashed potatoes, white and fluffy, with butter melting on top. Green beans, a piece of chicken, roasted until the skin was crispy. White bread, soft and fresh. A small cup of applesauce, and coffee. Real coffee. Dark and bitter and wonderful. The women stared at the food. They looked at each other. Was this a trick? Was it poisoned? Was this psychological torture, showing them food they couldn't eat? But the American soldiers at other tables were eating the same food, and the smell was too good to resist. Slowly, tentatively, Elsa picked up her fork and took a bite of mashed potatoes. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and took another bite. That broke the spell. The other women began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite. Others ate quickly, almost violently, shoveling food into their mouths as if afraid it would disappear. Margaret ate her chicken and felt tears streaming down her face again. She didn't bother wiping them away. The food tasted like everything she'd forgotten existed in the world. They ate everything on their trays. They licked their plates clean. And when a guard came by offering seconds, actual seconds, more food, some accepted, even though their stomachs were already cramping from the sudden richness after months of near starvation. As they ate, reality began to sink in. The order to sleep without your clothes had not been what they feared. It had been practical, necessary. The Americans were not torturing them. They were delousing them, feeding them, treating them like human beings. But this realization brought its own kind of pain. Because if the Americans were not the monsters they'd been taught to fear, then what did that say about everything else they'd been told? What did it say about the war they'd just lost? What did it say about the regime they had served? And that was when the real transformation began. The days at Camp Ruston fell into a rhythm both comforting and disorienting. A bell rang at 6 a.m. The women woke in simple wooden barracks with rows of cots, but each cot had a mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. Compared to the conditions they'd endured in Germany's final months, this was luxury. After the first night, they were issued proper prisoner uniforms. Not gray Wehrmacht uniforms, but simple work clothes. Blue denim pants and shirts like American factory workers wore. The clothes were clean, worn but functional. They came with underwear, socks, and sturdy work boots. Real boots. Not the cardboard-soled shoes that had fallen apart during Germany's retreat. Breakfast at 7:00. They lined up at the mess hall and received trays with food that still seemed impossible. Scrambled eggs, toast with jam, oatmeal with sugar, orange juice, and coffee. Always coffee. The Americans seemed to run on coffee. The women learned to drink it too, though at first the bitter taste made them wince. After breakfast came work assignments. The Geneva Convention required prisoners of war be given work, but the work had to be reasonable and humane. The women were assigned various tasks. Some worked in the camp laundry, washing and folding endless piles of military uniforms and bed sheets. Others worked in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and washing dishes. A few with medical training, like Elsa, were assigned to help in the camp infirmary, treating minor injuries and illnesses under American doctors' supervision. The work was not particularly hard. Nothing compared to the back-breaking labor some had done in German factories during the war, where they'd worked 12-hour shifts making ammunition. Here, they worked 8 hours a day with breaks for water and rest. The guards supervised but didn't abuse. If someone worked slowly, guards might make an impatient comment, but there were no beatings, no punishments, no cruelty. And they were paid. This was perhaps the most shocking part. Each week the women received camp scrip, paper money that could only be used within the POW camp system. Not much, maybe the equivalent of a few dollars a week. But it was something. They could use it at the camp canteen. The canteen was a small building near the center of camp where prisoners could buy items with their scrip. The first time Margaret walked inside, she thought she'd stumbled into a dream. The shelves held chocolate bars, Hershey's and Milky Ways, cigarettes, Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields, chewing gum, Wrigley's spearmint, soap and toothpaste and shampoo, combs and hand mirrors, pencils and paper, even magazines and books, though most were in English. The women stood in front of these shelves like children at a toy shop window. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Most hadn't tasted chocolate since before the war. Margaret bought a Hershey bar with her first week's scrip and ate it slowly, letting each square melt on her tongue, trying to make it last. It was almost painful in its sweetness. Others bought lipstick. The canteen sold a few shades, reds and pinks that looked absurdly bright and civilian. But the women bought them anyway. They applied lipstick in the barrack mirrors and stared at themselves, trying to remember who they'd been before the war. Before the uniforms. Before the defeat. Some bought cigarettes and smoked in designated areas, standing with their American captors who were also on smoke breaks. The language barrier made conversation difficult, but some things transcended words. The shared ritual of lighting a cigarette, taking a drag, exhaling smoke. These were universal. But then, something happened that would change everything again. The letters started arriving in August. The Red Cross had finally established a system for POWs to send and receive mail from Germany. The first batch of letters hit the camp like a bomb. Margaret received a letter from her mother. The envelope was thin, the paper inside torn from a notebook, the handwriting shaky and hard to read. Her mother wrote, "My dear girl, I am alive. I am in Hamburg still, living in the basement of what used to be the Schneider building. The house is gone. Everything is gone. We eat potato soup if we are lucky. Most days we have nothing. The black market has bread for 10 times what we can afford. Your cousin Klaus died last week of dysentery. I do not know where you are. I do not know if you are alive. If you get this letter, please tell me you are safe. That is all I need to know." Margaret read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. Her mother was alive. That was the good news. But the rest, the starvation, the disease, the continued suffering, it was almost unbearable. Especially sitting here in Camp Ruston where she'd eaten chicken and mashed potatoes for lunch and would eat pot roast for dinner. Elsa received a letter from her sister in Berlin. The letter described the Soviet occupation zone where women weren't safe on the streets at night. It described hunger so severe people were eating grass and tree bark. It described winters without fuel where old people froze to death in their beds. The letter ended. "We heard you were captured by the Americans. We hear that is the best thing that could have happened. Is it true they feed you? If so, thank God. At least one of us is safe." Frau Weber got a letter from her son who'd survived the war and was now living in a refugee camp in Bavaria. He wrote about standing in line for hours to get a cup of watery soup. He wrote about watching children die of starvation. He wrote, "Mother, I hope you are treated well. I hope the Americans are not cruel. Whatever they do to you, it cannot be worse than what we are living through here." The women sat in their barracks that evening holding their letters, unable to speak. The guilt was crushing. They were prisoners, defeated. But they were warm and fed and safe. Their families were free, but starving and desperate. The irony was not lost on them. The victors ate well. The defeated starved. But somehow here in this POW camp, the math was wrong. The prisoners ate better than the victors back home. The captives were safer than the free. And that revelation would tear them apart from the inside. Some women couldn't eat after receiving letters. They pushed their dinner trays away, unable to stomach food while imagining their families going hungry. Others ate with desperate intensity, as if they could eat enough for their families too. As if consuming calories here could somehow transfer them to their starving loved ones back home. They wrote back, of course. Careful letters that would pass the censors. "I am safe. I am healthy. The Americans treat us according to the Geneva Convention. I have enough to eat. I work, but the work is not hard. I am alive. I hope you are too." What they couldn't write. "I eat 3 meals a day plus dessert. I have chocolate and lipstick. I sleep on a mattress with clean sheets. I shower with hot water. I am living better than I lived during the war. I am living better than you are now. I do not know how to feel about this. I do not know what this means." The letters kept coming week after week. Each one brought news of continued suffering in Germany. Food shortages, coal shortages, medicine shortages. The German economy had collapsed completely. The black market ruled everything. People traded family heirlooms for bread. Young women sold themselves for cigarettes. And meanwhile in Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the German women POWs got fatter. But not all the guards were kind, and what happened next would test everything they thought they understood. Not all guards were kind, but most weren't cruel either. They were just young American men, many no older than the women they guarded, doing a job they found alternately boring and awkward. How do you guard women? How do you maintain authority without being harsh? How do you balance security with basic human decency? Different guards found different answers. There was Private Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, who always looked embarrassed conducting roll call. He would read names off his clipboard, mispronouncing every single German name, and the women would correct him gently. Eventually it became a ritual. He would say, "Margarete," and she would say, "Margaret," and he would repeat it badly and they would both smile. There was Sergeant Williams, a black soldier from Alabama who had no love for German prisoners. His brother had died at Normandy, but who believed in treating people fairly. He was strict, but never mean. He enforced the rules but also made sure the women got what they were entitled to under the Geneva Convention. When one of the younger women got sick with pneumonia, he personally drove her to the base hospital and stayed to make sure she received proper treatment. There was Corporal Martinez from Texas, who spoke a little German because his grandmother had been from Bavaria. He became an informal translator, helping smooth communication. He taught the women English phrases. Good morning. Thank you. Excuse me. And they taught him German jokes, which he rarely understood but always laughed at anyway. Then one afternoon in September, something unexpected happened. It was raining hard. One of those sudden Louisiana thunderstorms that turned the sky black and dumped water like buckets. The women were outside, walking back from the laundry building to their barracks when the storm hit. They started running, but the rain was so heavy they were soaked within seconds. Private Johnson was on duty nearby. He saw them running, saw how wet they were getting, and made a decision. He opened the door to the guard station, normally off limits to prisoners, and gestured frantically. "Come on, get out of the rain," he shouted. The women hesitated. Was this a trick? A test? But the rain was torrential, and Johnson looked genuinely concerned. They ducked inside the guard station, dripping water everywhere. Johnson grabbed towels from a supply cabinet and handed them out. He made coffee on a hot plate and poured it into tin cups. The women stood there wrapped in army towels, drinking army coffee in an army guard station, while the rain hammered on the roof. Johnson sat at his desk and read a magazine, acting like this was completely normal. They stayed for 20 minutes until the storm passed. Then Johnson opened the door and said, "Okay, you can go now. Stay dry." And they walked back to their barracks, looking back at him with expressions he couldn't read. Later, Margaret tried to explain to the others what that moment meant. "He didn't have to do that," she said. "He could have let us get soaked. We are prisoners. He could have just watched. But he didn't. He saw people in the rain and he helped them. That is what he did." These small moments accumulated. A guard sharing his newspaper so the women could practice reading English. A guard giving them his pack of gum when he saw them working hard in the heat. A guard looking the other way when one of the women picked a wildflower from outside the fence to keep in her barrack. None were grand gestures. None erased the fact of captivity. But they were gestures of basic humanity, and they confused everything the women thought they knew about their enemies. But the deepest confusion, the most shattering realization, was yet to come. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was slow, painful, and deeply personal. Each woman wrestled with it in her own way. Margaret wrote in a small notebook she'd bought from the canteen. She wrote in German, knowing the censors would read it, but not caring. What are we supposed to think? They told us the Americans were savages. They told us that surrender meant death, or worse than death. They told us we would be tortured and starved. But here we are, clean, fed, safe. Were they lying to us about everything? She stopped writing and stared at the words. Were they lying to us? The question was dangerous, because if the answer was yes, then everything she had believed for years was a lie. The cause she had served, the sacrifices she had made, the friends and family who had died. All of it based on lies. But if the answer was no, if somehow the propaganda had been partially true, then how to explain this? How to explain the food, the medicine, the basic human decency? How to explain Private Johnson making coffee during a rainstorm? Elsa approached the question differently. She was older, more pragmatic. She had seen enough of war to know that everyone lied. That propaganda was a tool all sides used. The question for her was not whether she had been lied to, but what that meant going forward. "We served a government that lied to us," she told a group of women one evening. "We served a government that led us into a war we could not win. That got millions killed. That destroyed our country. And for what? For nothing. And now we are here eating American food. And back home our families starve. What does that tell us?" The younger women didn't want to hear this. It was too painful. But Elsa pressed on. "It tells us we were fools. It tells us we believed in something that was not worth believing in. It tells us the Americans, whatever else they are, had the power to win and the sense not to starve their prisoners. But they bombed our cities, one of the young women protested. They killed civilians, Dresden, Hamburg, they destroyed everything. Yes, Elsa said quietly. They did, and we started it. We invaded Poland, we invaded France, we invaded Russia, we started this war, and when you start a war, you do not get to complain about how the other side finishes it. The words hung heavy in the barrack. Some women nodded, others looked away. One young woman, Greta, the 17-year-old, began to cry. She had been raised on Nazi propaganda from childhood. She had joined the Helferinnen because she believed in the cause. Now that belief was crumbling, and she had nothing to replace it with. The debates continued through the fall. The women argued about politics, about morality, about what it meant to have served the Reich. Some tried to defend their actions. We were just doing our jobs. We were not soldiers. We did not shoot anyone. We were clerks and nurses. Others were less forgiving. Our jobs supported the war machine. We were part of it. We cannot pretend we were innocent. What made these debates particularly painful was the context. They were having these conversations while eating chocolate bars. They were questioning their life choices while wearing clean clothes and sleeping in beds with mattresses. The comfort of captivity made everything feel absurd. But then something happened that would crystallize everything, and force them to confront the truth they'd been avoiding. In October, a new batch of German POWs arrived at Camp Rustin. Male prisoners this time. Soldiers captured in the final days of the war. They were marched past the women's section of camp on their way to processing. The women watched them through the fence. These men looked like ghosts. Emaciated. Filthy. Many still wearing the ragged remains of Wehrmacht uniforms. They stared straight ahead with dead eyes, expecting the worst. The women knew that in a few hours these men would be showered, deloused, fed, and given clean clothes. They would have the same experience the women had had. They would go through the same shock of discovering that American captivity was not what Nazi propaganda had promised. Margaret watched the men march past and felt something shift inside her. She remembered how she had looked when she arrived. Terrified. Prepared for the worst. And she realized that the transformation she had undergone was not unique to her. It was happening to every German prisoner who encountered American treatment. "We are all learning the same lesson," she said quietly to Elsa, who stood beside her at the fence. "We are all discovering we were lied to." "Yes," Elsa agreed. "The question is, what we do with that knowledge." By November, the women had been at Camp Rustin for 4 months. They looked completely different from the terrified, half-starved women who had arrived in July. They had gained weight. Their hair was shiny and healthy. Their skin glowed. They looked like normal women again, not the walking dead. This physical transformation forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. America had not just defeated Germany militarily. America had defeated Germany in every way that mattered. Germany's cities were rubble. Germany's economy was destroyed. Germany's people were starving. America's cities were intact. America's economy was booming. America's people were prosperous. The women saw this in every aspect of camp life. The abundance of food was not just for prisoners. The guards ate the same food, sometimes more. The clean clothes, the hot water, the electricity that ran 24 hours a day. These were normal things for Americans. Not special luxuries. Just normal. Frau Weber, the oldest of the prisoners, put it into words one evening. "We did not just lose a war. We lost a contest of civilizations. We believed we were superior. That our way was better. That we would build an empire to last 1,000 years. And we were wrong about everything. The Americans built something real while we built something on lies. And now we are here eating their food, wearing their clothes, living under their rules. And their rules are better than ours ever were." This was the deepest cut. Not just that they had lost, but that they deserved to lose. That the side they had served was not just defeated, but wrong. That the enemy was not the monster they had imagined, but something more complicated, and in many ways more admirable. The women began to understand that the American strategy was not physical domination, but moral demonstration. by treating prisoners well, by feeding them and clothing them and showing them what a functioning democracy looked like. The Americans were conducting a kind of re-education. They were saying, look at what we built. Look at how we treat people, even our enemies. This is what you could have had if you had chosen differently. It was effective, more effective than any torture or cruelty could have been. Because you can hate someone who hurts you. But what do you do with someone who helps you? How do you maintain your hatred for someone who gives you food when you are hungry, who shelters you when you are cold, who treats you with basic human decency? You cannot. The hatred crumbles, and in its place grows something more complex: respect, gratitude, and a deep, painful shame for having been on the wrong side. But the final blow, the revelation that would complete their transformation, was still to come. In December, the women received news that would change everything. Germany had officially surrendered months ago, but the occupation was ongoing. There were discussions about when and how to repatriate POWs. The first group of women prisoners would be sent home in January 1946. The women had expected to be overjoyed at this news. They were going home. They would see their families. They would return to Germany. But instead of joy, they felt dread. Because what were they going home to? Letters from their families painted a bleak picture: starvation, disease, chaos. The Soviet zone was a nightmare. The British and American zones were better, but still devastated. No jobs, no housing, no food. The black market ruled everything. Crime was rampant. And here in Camp Ruston, they were safe. They had 3 meals a day. They had work to do. They had shelter. They had medical care. In a twisted way, captivity had become a refuge. Margaret lay awake in her bunk one night, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts she could barely admit to herself. She did not want to go home. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She did not want to return to Germany. She wanted to stay here, where she was fed and safe. But how could she think such a thing? She was a prisoner. She was supposed to want freedom. She was supposed to want to return to her homeland, to her family, to her life. Except she had no life to return to. Her city was rubble. Her home was destroyed. Her job didn't exist anymore. Her father was dead. Her brother was missing. Her mother was starving in a basement. What exactly was she going home to? She was not alone in these thoughts. Other women admitted similar feelings in whispered conversations after lights out. They were terrified to go home. Terrified of the hunger, the chaos, the judgment. Because they knew that when they returned, they would be questioned. Where were you during the war? What did you do? Why do you look so healthy when we are all starving? How could they explain that they had been POWs in America and that it had saved them? How could they explain that captivity had been a blessing? They couldn't. They would be resented, perhaps even hated, for having had it easy while others suffered. In late December, 2 weeks before the first transport was scheduled to leave, something happened that made everything even more complicated. The camp held a Christmas celebration for the prisoners. The Americans set up a Christmas tree in the recreation hall, a real tree cut from the Louisiana woods, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. They played Christmas music on the radio, both American carols and German ones. They served a special dinner: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, rolls, and pie. Apple pie. The women sat at the tables staring at this feast, and many began to cry. It was too much. The kindness was too much. Here they were, defeated enemies, prisoners of war, and their captors were giving them Christmas dinner with turkey and pie. Private Johnson, the farm boy from Iowa, came around with a coffee pot, refilling cups. He stopped at Margaret's table and said something in English. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. "Merry Christmas." She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and managed to say in broken English, "Thank you. Thank you very much." He smiled, a little embarrassed, and moved on to the next table. That night, lying in her bunk, Margaret had her moment of complete transformation. She realized that the enemy she had been taught to hate was not an enemy at all. They were just people. People who had been on the opposite side of a war, but people nonetheless. people capable of kindness, generosity, and mercy. And she realized that the side she had served, the regime she had supported, would never have treated enemy prisoners this way, would never have given them Christmas dinner, would never have shown them basic human decency. The realization was both liberating and devastating. She was free from the propaganda, free from the lies. But she was also burdened with the knowledge of having been wrong, of having supported something evil, of having wasted years of her life on a cause that was not worth fighting for. The first transport left on January 15, 1946. 12 women were put on a train heading east, eventually to board a ship back to Europe. Margaret was not in this group. Her repatriation was scheduled for March, but she watched them leave with a mixture of envy and relief. The women being repatriated looked terrified. They had been given packages to take with them, Red Cross parcels containing chocolate, cigarettes, canned goods, and soap. These items would be valuable as black market currency back in Germany. But the women clutching these packages didn't look grateful. They looked like people being sent to their doom. "I do not want to leave," one of them said to Margaret the night before departure. "I know that makes me terrible. I know I should want to see my family. But I'm afraid. I am so afraid of going back there." Margaret had no comforting words to offer. She felt the same way. The thought of returning to Hamburg, to the ruins, to the starvation, to the chaos, filled her with cold, sick dread. When Margaret's turn came in March, she boarded the transport with a heavy heart. The journey back to Europe was the reverse of her journey to America, but it felt completely different. She was going toward uncertainty, toward hardship, toward a country that no longer existed in the form she had known. The ship docked in Bremen in early April 1946. The women disembarked into a Germany that was unrecognizable. The destruction was even worse than she had imagined. Entire city blocks were just rubble. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and desperate. Children begged for food. Old men sat on piles of broken brick, staring at nothing. Margaret made her way to Hamburg, traveling on trains that barely ran, showing her repatriation papers at checkpoint after checkpoint. When she finally reached her mother's basement dwelling, she almost didn't recognize the woman who answered her knock. Her mother was skeletal. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her hands shook with malnutrition. But when she saw Margaret, she began to cry. They held each other in the doorway of the basement, both weeping, unable to speak. Later, sitting in the cold basement with a single candle for light, Margaret gave her mother the Red Cross parcels she had brought. Her mother opened the packages with trembling fingers and stared at the contents: chocolate, canned meat, soap, as if they were treasures from another world, which, in a sense, they were. "You look well," her mother said, and there was a question in her voice, an accusation almost. "You look like you have been eating." Margaret didn't know how to respond. Yes, she had been eating. Yes, she looked healthy. Yes, while her mother was starving in a basement, she had been eating turkey dinners and apple pie in an American POW camp. How could she explain that? How could she justify it? She tried to explain what her captivity had been like, but her mother couldn't understand. "You were a prisoner and they fed you? They treated you well? That makes no sense. Why would they do that?" "Because that is what they do," Margaret said. "That is who they are. They follow rules. They have plenty. So they share. Even with prisoners. Even with enemies." Her mother was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Then we really did lose, didn't we? Not just the war, but everything. We believed we were superior. And we were wrong." Margaret spent the next years helping rebuild Germany. She worked as a translator for the American occupation authorities, using the English she had learned in the camp. She married in 1950, had 3 children, built a new life in the Federal Republic of Germany. But she never forgot Camp Rustin. She never forgot the fear she felt when the soldier said, "Sleep without your clothes." She never forgot the relief when she discovered it meant something innocent. She never forgot the hot water, the soap, the chocolate, the Christmas turkey. She told her children about her experiences, though it was not easy. How do you explain to your children that you were on the wrong side? That you served a regime that was evil, that you were captured by the enemy and it was the best thing that ever happened to you. But she believed they needed to know. They needed to understand that propaganda lies, that nations can be wrong, that sometimes the people you are taught to hate turn out to be the people who save you. Her oldest daughter once asked her, "Were you grateful to the Americans?" Margaret thought about this for a long time before answering. Grateful is too simple a word. I was confused. I was ashamed. I was angry at having been lied to. But yes, I was grateful. They could have treated us cruelly and no one would have blamed them. We were the enemy. Our country had started the war, had killed millions. They would have been justified in vengeance. But they chose something else. They chose to follow their rules, to treat us as human beings. And that choice taught me more about morality than anything else in my life. And so those 5 words, "sleep without your clothes," became something other than what they first appeared. They were not a threat, not a violation. They were a practical instruction about hygiene, about delousing, about the mundane realities of processing prisoners of war. But they represented something larger too. They represented the gap between propaganda and reality. They represented the fear that comes from years of being lied to. And they represented the difficult, complicated process of learning that your enemies might be more decent than your own leaders ever were. For the German women who passed through American POW camps during World War II, captivity became an unexpected education. They learned that America had not just military might, but moral authority. They learned that democracy, for all its flaws, produced a society that could afford to be generous, even to its enemies. They learned that the side that treats prisoners with dignity is probably the side that deserves to win. These lessons were painful. They required admitting that everything they had believed was wrong. But they were also necessary. Because only by confronting the truth about the war, about their side's crimes, about the lies they had been fed, could they begin to build something better. As Margaret said late in her life, that order to sleep without our clothes, it terrified us because we believed we knew what it meant. But we were wrong. We were wrong about so much. And learning we were wrong, as painful as it was, set us free. This is the story that deserves to be remembered. Not because it makes anyone look good, but because it reveals something true about the nature of war, propaganda, and the complicated process of moving from hatred to understanding. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. These histories matter. They teach us that enemies can become friends, that lies eventually crumble before truth, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through cruelty, but through unexpected acts of basic human decency. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Because in a world still full of propaganda and hatred, we need to remember, the truth always comes out. And sometimes, the people we're taught to fear are the ones who end up saving us. Thank you for watching. And remember, question everything you're told about your enemies. Because the next time you hear "sleep without your clothes," it might mean something completely different than what you expect.